The brush was heavy, heavier than it looked. It was a coarse bristled thing, meant for fences or barn walls, and the bucket of thin, chalky liquid sloshed at her feet with every dip and lift. The woman worked with a rhythm that was all her own, a slow and deliberate motion that ignored the crispness in the late autumn air and the growing line of wagons slowing on the dirt road that bordered her property. Dip, lift, and a long, careful stroke that turned the dark, furrowed bark of the peach tree a ghostly white. From the ground up to the first fork of the branches, she painted a stark armor against a world that had not yet decided to attack. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and wisps had escaped to stick to her forehead, damp with a sweat that had no business appearing in the November chill. Her blue prairie dress, clean that morning, now bore a spatter of white freckles across the skirt and sleeves. She did not look up. She did not have to. The sound of stopped wagons was a language she had come to learn. It was the sound of judgment. First came the quiet murmurs, the words indistinct but the tone as clear as a church bell. Then a single, loud voice cut through the creak of leather and the stamping of horses. It belonged to Mr. Harding, a man whose own land sprawled across the valley floor, a man whose confidence was as vast and unplowed as his holdings. What in creation is the girl doing to her father's trees? The question was not for her, but for the audience of farmers and ranchers who had paused their day to watch the spectacle. A few nervous chuckles followed. Another man, the blacksmith by the sound of his booming voice, shouted, "Looks like she's dressing them for a wedding, Harding." Or a funeral this time. The laughter was louder, less restrained. It rolled across the dry grass of the orchard and broke against her back. She kept painting. The white paint filled the crevices of the bark, a clean, flat color against the complex, living texture of the tree. She finished one and moved to the next, dragging the heavy bucket with a soft scrape over the hard-packed earth. Harding's voice came again, closer this time. He had evidently climbed down from his wagon. "Girl, your father, God rest him, knew how to work an orchard. He never saw fit to treat his trees like a picket fence. Whatever fool notion you've got in your head, you'd best put it out before you kill the whole lot." She stopped her work for a moment, not to look at him, but to dip the brush again, letting the excess drip back into the pail. She set the brush carefully on the rim and finally turned. Her face was calm, her eyes steady. She looked past Harding to the other men, their faces a mixture of pity and amusement. They saw a young woman, barely 25, alone with a failing orchard and a bucket of whitewash, and they saw a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. They saw a daughter's grief addling her mind. They saw an easy story to tell at the saloon that evening. What did she see? What truth was visible to this woman, alone in a field, that was invisible to an entire valley of men who had worked this same land their entire lives? What did she know about the sun and the cold, about the living skin of a tree, that they had never once thought to ask? She was reading a message written in the scars of the dead and dying, a message they had mistaken for bad luck, for a harsh winter, for the inscrutable will of God. They laughed because they had already decided on the answer. She was silent because she was too busy listening to the question. She picked up her brush. "It needs to be done," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Then she turned back to the tree and made the first white stroke on a new trunk, leaving the men and their laughter behind her on the road. The orchard had been her father's life, and in the end, it had been his death. Not in any sudden way, but in a slow erosion of spirit that matched the decay of his trees. He had bought the parcel of land with the belief that the gentle slope of the valley would protect the delicate blossoms from the worst of the late frosts. For a decade, he was right. The harvests were good, his peaches known for their sweetness all the way to the territorial capital. Then, the dying began. It was a quiet sickness, a few trees one year, a dozen the next. They would look healthy enough in the fall, their leaves turning gold and dropping as they should. But come spring, they would not wake up. Or worse, they would send out a few desperate, pale leaves before giving up, their branches stark and brittle against the green life surging around them. Her father had fought it with everything he knew. He'd pruned harder, fertilized more, spent money he didn't have on tonics and treatment sold by traveling salesmen with clever tongues. He filled notebooks with his observations, his neat, careful handwriting detailing the weather, the soil conditions, the bloom dates. The pages were a testament to his love and his frustration. Another hard freeze in April, he wrote one year. The wind from the north is a killer. He saw enemies everywhere, in the ice, the wind, the soil, a blight he couldn't name. He never saw the pattern. He died in his bed, looking out the window at the skeletal rows of his failed ambition, his last notebook lying open on the bedside table. The property, and the debt attached to it, fell to her. She was his only child, her mother gone years before. The community's sympathy was real, but it was thin. It came with casseroles and quiet visits for a month. Then came the advice. Sell the land, girl, Mr. Harding had told her, his tone not unkind but firm, the tone of a man stating an obvious fact. It's too much for you. A woman can't run an orchard alone, others echoed him. They saw her as an extension of her father's failure, a final, sad chapter to a story they already knew the ending of. Her inheritance was not the land, not really. It was the debt, the dying trees, and the stack of notebooks. For weeks, she did nothing but walk the rows, the silence of the place pressing in on her. The orchard felt like a graveyard, and she its reluctant keeper. She read her father's notebooks every night by the light of a kerosene lamp, the smell of the oil mixing with the faint, dusty scent of the old paper. She felt the weight of his effort on every page, the meticulous recording of a war he was losing without ever identifying the true enemy. He had been a good man, a careful man. But his gaze had been fixed on the things he expected to be the problem, the known culprits of frost and disease. He had looked, but he had not seen. And so, with the town's pity curdling into impatience, she began to walk the rows not as a mourner, but as a detective. She would not let his work be for nothing. She would honor his effort by finding the one thing he had missed. The land may have been his failure, but she would not let it be his legacy. The work of seeing began with her hands. She walked past the healthy trees, the ones whose bark was rough and whole, and went to the sick ones. The ones her father had marked with a sad, painted X. She ran her palms over their trunks, feeling for the floor. At first, she felt nothing but the coarse, indifferent skin of the wood. But she was patient. She had inherited her father's methodical nature, if not his conclusions. Day after day, she walked. She carried one of his empty notebooks, determined to fill it with what she saw, not what she assumed. She started a map, a careful drawing of the entire orchard, marking each tree, healthy, sick, or dead. And slowly, under the patient pressure of her attention, the pattern began to emerge. It was not random. The damage was not everywhere. It was specific. On every sick tree, on every dead tree, the wound was in the exact same place, a long, vertical scar of dead, cracked bark on the southwest side of the trunk. It was often subtle, a place where the bark seemed sunken, or where a dark, gummy sap oozed, a sign of the life bleeding out from within. On the dead trees, the bark had sloughed off completely in that one spot, revealing the dead, dry wood beneath. The rest of the tree, the north and east sides, often looked perfectly fine. She spent a week confirming it, walking every row, her fingers tracing the wounds. Southwest. Always southwest. She went back to her father's notebooks, hunting for any mention of it. He had noted the dead bark, but dismissed it as rot that set in after the tree was already weakened by the cold. To him, it was a symptom, not a cause. He had written, "The freeze takes the life, and the rot takes the body." He had been so sure the killer was the winter's lowest temperature. But this pattern argued against him. If a deep freeze was the culprit, the damage should be uniform, or at least random. It wouldn't be so surgically precise, targeting only one side of the tree. An old farmhand named Samuel, who had worked for her father for 20 years, still came by once a week, mostly out of loyalty. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of sun and seasons. He watched her strange new ritual without comment, watched her touching the trees, making her notes. One afternoon, she showed him the map. "Look," she said, pointing with a dirt-stained finger. "It's always here." The wound faces the afternoon sun. Samuel looked at the map, then at the nearest tree, then back at her. He squinted, his silence a deep well of thought. "The sun is strong there," he said, finally. Even in winter he said nothing more, but he had given her a crucial piece of the puzzle. The sun. The winter sun was not a source of life, but an accomplice in the killing. The cold was the weapon, but the sun was aiming it. The idea felt like a heresy. In a world of farming, the sun was an ally, a force for growth and good. To suggest it was part of the problem felt like blaming the rain for a flood. She searched her father's books again, but found nothing. He, like everyone else, saw the winter sun as weak and harmless. Her breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a tattered copy of a farmer's almanac from a decade prior, used to press flowers inside a book of her mother's poetry. Tucked in the back, among advertisements for patent medicines and lightning rods, was a short column from a professor at an agricultural college back east. It was titled "On the Dangers of a Winter Thaw." He described a phenomenon he called sunscald. The words on the page seemed to rise up to meet her own observations. On a clear winter day, he wrote, the low afternoon sun could strike the dark bark of a tree with surprising intensity. The dark bark would absorb the heat, warming up far above the ambient air temperature. This warmth could be enough to wake the dormant, living cambium layer just beneath the bark. The tree, tricked by the false promise of spring, would draw water into its cells. Then, as the sun set, the temperature would plummet. The reactivated, water-filled cells would freeze solid, bursting and dying. It was a cycle of warming and freezing, a daily betrayal enacted by the sun and the cold. The result was a long, vertical strip of dead tissue, exactly where the afternoon sun was strongest, the southwest side. Everything clicked into place. The pattern, the location of the wounds, her father's bafflement. He had been looking for a single event, a brutal night of cold, but the damage was from 1,000 small cuts, a slow and repeated injury happening all winter long. The article concluded with a simple, almost rustic-sounding preventative measure. A coating of light-colored paint, a simple whitewash of lime and water, could reflect the sun's rays instead of absorbing them. It would keep the bark at the same temperature as the air, keeping the tree safely asleep until the real spring arrived. It was so simple, so logical, it felt like a revelation. She found Samuel mending a fence line the next morning and explained the entire theory to him, her words tumbling out with the excitement of her discovery. She showed him the almanac. He listened patiently, his eyes on the page, his expression unreadable. He handed it back to her. He did not challenge her. He did not call her a fool. He simply looked at her, then at the long rows of trees, and a deep sadness seemed to settle over his shoulders. "Your father was a smart man," he said, his voice raspy. He tried everything he knew that afternoon. He finished mending the fence, gathered his tools, and wished her well. He did not say he was quitting. He just didn't come back the next week. His absence was a quiet verdict. The idea was too strange, too far outside the bounds of what was known. In his silent departure, she understood she was truly alone. Her theory would have to stand on its own, without allies, against the collected wisdom of the entire valley. She began the work with a grim determination, her only companions the quiet ghosts of her father's failed attempts. The recipe in the almanac was simple, lime and water. She bought sacks of lime from the general store, enduring the storekeeper's curious stare as she hauled them onto her wagon herself. She mixed the whitewash in a large wooden barrel, the water turning a milky, opaque white, the smell sharp and clean in the autumn air. The labor was harder than she had imagined. Each tree was a battle. The bark drank the thin mixture, and she had to apply 2, sometimes 3 coats to achieve a solid, reflective white. Her shoulders ached, her hands grew raw inside her work gloves, and her back screamed in protest by the end of each day. But with every white trunk that stood gleaming in the low sun, she felt a small, fierce satisfaction. She was not just painting trees, she was armoring them. She was fighting back against the invisible enemy that had stolen her father's livelihood and his spirit. The mockery from the road was a constant chorus to her work, but she learned to tune it out, to focus on the sound of her brush against the bark, the slosh of the lime wash in the bucket. She worked through the end of November, until every single tree in her orchard was painted white from its base to its first branches. They looked like a silent army of ghosts, strange and out of place in the brown landscape. Then the winter came, and with it, her first test. It was a season of storms, not just cold. A week of freezing rain encased the valley in a sheath of ice, the sheer weight of it snapping branches from oaks and cottonwoods. The thick ice clung to her painted trees, and she watched with a growing sense of dread as the rain, followed by a sudden thaw, seemed to dissolve the thin layer of lime. The whitewash, not bound by anything but water, ran in milky rivers down the trunks, leaving them streaked and mottled, their dark bark exposed once more in ugly patches. By February, most of her work had been undone. The spring revealed the cost of her failure. She lost another 20 trees. It was fewer than the year before, a small victory, but it was a devastating blow. The partial protection had saved some, but it hadn't been enough. The talk in town, which had been amused, now turned to pitying condescension. The county commissioner, a man named Patterson, made a special trip out to her property. He walked with her through the dead trees, his hands clasped behind his back. "Young woman," he said, his voice dripping with bureaucratic patience, "I admire your industry. Truly. But you must listen to reason. Trees need the sun. It is the source of their life. By painting the bark, you are interfering with nature's design. This is what comes of a woman's fancy getting the better of her sense." He patted her shoulder, a gesture meant to be kind, but that felt like a final dismissal. He left her standing there, surrounded by the evidence of her failure, the ghost army in tatters, her great theory seemingly dead. For a week, she did not go into the orchard. The sight of the streaked trunks and the newly dead trees was a physical pain. The commissioner's words echoed in her mind, layering on top of the town's mockery. Doubt, a seed she had refused to let sprout, began to grow. Had they all been right? Was this just a grief-stricken fantasy, a desperate attempt to find an order in the chaos that had consumed her father? She sat with his notebooks, the pages filled with his own dead ends and mistaken beliefs. It would be easy to give up, to sell the land to Harding for whatever he would offer and leave this place of failure behind. But the pattern remained. The failure of her method did not invalidate her observation. The wounds were still on the southwest side. The whitewash had been too thin, too temporary. The idea was right, the execution was wrong. On a cold March morning, she made a decision. She would not be defeated by a bucket of bad paint. She sat at her small kitchen table and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the agricultural college mentioned in the almanac, to the professor who had written the article on Sunscald. She filled 4 pages, writing not with emotion, but with the cool precision of a scientist. She described her orchard, her father's failures, her observation of the southwest pattern, her Sunscald theory. She detailed her attempt with the lime and water, and its failure during the winter storms. She asked, simply, "What did I do wrong?" She posted the letter and prepared to wait. The mail came only once a week, and the journey back east was long. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Spring arrived in full, and she tended to the surviving trees with a heavy heart, pruning the deadwood, feeling like a general tending to a defeated army. The waiting was its own form of torture. Then, one day in late May, the letter arrived. The envelope was thick, the return address printed, not handwritten. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was from the professor himself. He began by commending her remarkable powers of observation and her sound deductive reasoning. He confirmed her Sunscald diagnosis, calling it a classic case. He wrote that her failure was not of theory, but of chemistry. A simple lime wash, he explained, would never survive a harsh winter. He then gave her a new recipe, one they had been testing at the college. To the lime and water, she was to add 2 things, salt, to act as a mild disinfectant, and, most importantly, tallow or clay. The fatty tallow or sticky clay would act as a binder, creating a durable, flexible paint that would adhere to the bark and withstand the rain and ice. He ended the letter with a line that she would read over and over until it was etched into her memory: "Few farmers possess your eye for detail. Do not let the skepticism of others deter you from the evidence of your own senses." It was more than a recipe, it was a benediction. It was the first time an educated man had spoken to her not as a foolish girl, but as an intellectual equal. The doubt that had plagued her vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She would not fail again. The work began again in the fall, but this time it was different. There was no hopeful uncertainty, only grim resolve. She bought the lime and the salt, but the tallow was another matter. She had to render it herself from suet purchased from the butcher, a hot, smelly, difficult job that filled the small cabin with the greasy scent of melted fat for 2 days. She mixed the new formula in the same wooden barrel. The concoction was thick and heavy, more like a plaster than a paint. It clung to the brush, heavy and dense, and applying it was a slow, arduous process. She had to work it into every crevice of the bark. It took twice as long per tree, and the physical cost was immense. The autumn days grew shorter, colder. She worked from the first grey light of dawn until her hands were too numb to grip the brush and the sun was a faint memory behind the western hills. Her mother, who had come to stay with her after her father's death, watched from the kitchen window. Her face was a constant mask of quiet fear. It was not the work that frightened her, it was the community. She had heard the whispers in town, the way the men now spoke of her daughter not with amusement, but with a hard-edged contempt. She was no longer just the grieving, foolish girl, she was stubborn, defiant, a woman who refused to listen to the sense of men. The wagons on the road no longer slowed for a laugh. They sped up, the drivers turning their faces away as if the sight of her was an affront. She was an outcast, painting her strange white symbols on the trees, and her isolation was now complete. But inside that isolation, she found a kind of freedom. She was no longer performing for anyone's approval. She was simply engaged in a dialogue with the land, with the trees, with the truth she had uncovered. Each painted trunk was a statement. It was an act of faith in her own observation, a monument to the professor's letter, a quiet refutation of every man who had laughed or dismissed her. She finished the last tree just as the first snow flurries began to fall. The orchard stood ready. The white trunks were stark and brilliant against the darkening earth, each one a soldier in a uniform of her own making. As she cleaned the tallow and lime from her hands that night, the skin raw and chapped, she felt no triumph, only a quiet, bone-deep readiness. She had done the work. She had listened to the evidence and corrected her error. Now, all she could do was wait for the verdict of the winter. She had wagered everything, her reputation, her last bit of money, the future of the orchard, on the theory that a coat of white paint could stand between a tree and the sun. The winter would be the judge, and its judgment would be absolute. That winter was the kind that old men would talk about for decades to come. It did not arrive gently. It descended on the valley like a hammer blow in mid-December and did not relent for 3 months. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that cracked axe handles and turned breath to instant frost. The wind scoured the ridges, piling snow into monstrous drifts that buried fence lines and made roads impassable for weeks at a time. In town, the talk was of livestock lost to the cold, of dwindling firewood supplies. For the valley's farmers, the great fear was for the orchards. Such a deep and prolonged freeze, everyone agreed, would be devastating. They spoke of it with a kind of fatalism, as an act of God against which there was no defense. In her small cabin, Abigail waited. The snow piled up against her door, isolating her even more completely. Her days fell into a simple, monastic rhythm. She kept the fire fed, tended to her mother, and read her father's notebooks, not for information anymore, but for the company of his presence. Once a day, when the wind died down, she would wrap herself in heavy wool and walk the edge of the orchard. The silence was profound. The trees stood half buried in snow, their white trunks almost blending with the landscape, only their darker, unpainted branches visible against the grey sky. She would go to the nearest tree and place her bare hand against the painted bark. It was cold. It was as cold as the air, as cold as the snow it stood in. There was no hint of warmth, no trace of the sun's betrayal. She would press her ear to the trunk, listening for something she knew she couldn't hear, for the deep, slow life held in suspended animation within. She was not anxious. The professor's letter had inoculated her against doubt. She had a quiet confidence that felt like coming home to a truth she had always known. She had done what was necessary. The trees were either safe in their white armor, or they were not. There was nothing more to be done. While the men in town gathered around the stove in the general store, swapping stories of past hard winters and predicting ruin, she stood alone in the piercing cold, her hand on a tree, listening to the silence. She was waiting for the spring, not with hope, but with expectation. The evidence had been gathered, the experiment was underway, and the results were coming. The thaw, when it came, was slow and grudging. The snow melted in patches, revealing a landscape that was bruised and battered. The whole valley held its breath, waiting for the first signs of life. In the other orchards, the news was bad. But break was late, and when it came, it was sparse. On many trees, entire limbs remained bare. On others, only the lowest, most protected branches showed any green. Mr. Harding, it was said, had lost nearly half his orchard, the trees that lined the exposed western edge of his property standing like a line of skeletons. The deep cold, everyone agreed, had been too much. But in Abigail's orchard, something different was happening. From the road, it looked like a miracle. While the surrounding hillsides were still a hesitant, patchy green, her trees exploded with blossoms. They burst forth in a riot of pink and white, a wave of defiant life that was so dense and uniform it seemed to hum with energy. There were no dead limbs, no barren patches. Every tree, from the first row to the last, was cloaked in a canopy of perfect, vibrant flowers. The wagons on the road began to slow again. But this time, there was no laughter. There was only a stunned, bewildered silence. Men who had mocked her now stood at her fence line and stared, their faces tight with a confusion they could not voice. They saw the impossible result, but they could not bring themselves to acknowledge the cause. They attributed it to luck, to a sheltered pocket of land, to some fluke of the soil. They found a dozen reasons, because any reason was better than admitting that the foolish girl with the paintbrush had been right all along. The harvest was the final, irrefutable proof. While other farmers brought meager, undersized fruit to market, her wagons were laden with peaches. They were large, unblemished, and so heavy with juice they filled the air with their scent. She set up her stand at the weekly market, and a quiet, tense drama unfolded. One by one, the men who had laughed at her came to buy her fruit. Mr. Harding was the first. He approached her stand, his gaze fixed on the crates of peaches, refusing to meet her eyes. "Good crop," he mumbled, the words sounding like they were being pulled from him with pliers. "I'll take a bushel." She weighed his order, took his money, and thanked him, her voice even and calm. She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology. She simply sold him the evidence of his error. Each transaction was the same, a silent man, an averted gaze, and the quiet exchange of coin for fruit. They were not just buying peaches. They were buying the bitter taste of a truth they could no longer deny. The following autumn, she saw it. A flash of white in the distance, on the far side of the valley. She walked to the edge of her property and shaded her eyes. It was unmistakable. On Mr. Harding's land, a crew of men was moving down the rows of his surviving peach trees, painting the trunks white. They were using her method, her strange, foolish idea that had now become a desperate necessity. The next year, 2 more of her neighbors did the same. Within 5 years, nearly every orchard in the valley had adopted the practice. The sight of white-trunked trees in the fall became a normal part of the landscape, as common as autumn leaves and wood smoke. It became a piece of local wisdom, a thing a man did to protect his trees from a hard winter. But her name was never spoken in connection with it. The story of her discovery was erased, smoothed over, until it was gone. The men who had laughed the loudest became the staunchest practitioners, explaining the logic of it to newcomers as if they had devised it themselves. Her vindication was complete, but it was also anonymous. She had won the argument, but they had kept the credit. She continued to run her orchard, her harvests consistently the best in the valley, a quiet, constant reminder of the truth she had unearthed. She never spoke of it, never pointed out the irony. She didn't have to. The trees themselves, standing in their white armor every winter, were her witnesses. You have probably been in a room like that. A room where a decision is being made, and the people with the authority to make it have already settled on the answer before the evidence has been presented. You have heard the tone of voice they use, patient, condescending, final, for any idea that comes from outside their circle of certainty. They are not bad people. They are simply confident. And their confidence is a fortress, its walls built from the comfortable assumption that they already know everything that is worth knowing. A fact is not a fact to them until it is spoken by a voice they have already decided to respect. And if you are not one of those voices, your evidence is just noise. Your truth is just a woman's fancy. What do? You can argue, but an argument requires a listener. You can shout, but a shout is just more noise. Or you can do the work. You can do what she did. You can pick up your bucket and your brush. You can be methodical, and you can be patient. You can let their laughter roll off your back. You can face the failure of your first attempt and learn from it. You can stand alone in the winter of their disapproval, your hand on the cold bark of a truth only you can feel. And you can wait for the harvest. Because a harvest is an argument that cannot be ignored. It is a fact that speaks for itself. They may never admit you were right. They may steal your method and call it their own. But they will eat the fruit of the tree you saved. And that, sometimes, has to be enough.